Hi, my name is Austin Hounsel, and I'm a PhD student at Princeton University. And generally speaking, I'm interested in internet performance and privacy. Today, I'm going to be presenting some measurements we conducted comparing DNS, DNS over TLS, and DNS over HTTPS performance through the FCC's Measuring Broadband America program. This work was done in collaboration with Paul Schmitt, Kevin Borgolte, and Nick Feamster. So generally speaking, the DNS is often considered the phone book of the internet. It's responsible for translating domain names such as princeton.edu into IP addresses. In recent years, DNS privacy has become a significant concern. Whenever you connect to a network, such as a coffee shop Wi-Fi, every DNS query that you issue can be seen by the owner of the network. This is because all DNS queries and responses are unencrypted. This information can then be used to infer which websites users are visiting and can be used for various other purposes. In response, two encrypted DNS protocols have been proposed. One is DNS over TLS, and the other is DNS over HTTPS. And although these protocols were only standardized within the past few years, they are seeing gradual increased deployment. So for example, in Mozilla Firefox, DOE is now the default DNS protocol for users in the United States with an option to opt out. We thus believe it is critical to study the performance of these protocols. If they don't perform well, then millions of users could potentially be affected, such as when they're browsing the internet. So there are two primary research questions we want to answer. First is, how do DNS dot and DOE perform from home networks? So for this study, when we refer to performance, we are referring in particular to DNS query response times. Second, how is each protocol affected by changes in network behavior? And by changes in network behavior, we're referring to an increase in latency to recursive resolvers and downstream throughput. I want to note that we're particularly interested in studying performance from home networks because this gives us a sense of how the average user might experience a performance of each protocol in their day-to-day. So I'm going to briefly describe how we perform the measurements before diving into our results. So to perform measurements from home networks, we collaborate with the FCC and Sam Knows to utilize the Measuring Broadband America platform, or the MBA. The MBA platform is an FCC program developed to address a congressional mandate for publicly accessible broadband measurements. Sam Knows are contracted by the FCC to handle its operational and logistical aspects. Sam Knows develops, in turn, custom hardware and software packages called white boxes that plug into volunteers' home routers. This enables them to measure various aspects of network performance from their homes. For this study, we utilized the white boxes connected to the routers in people's homes to measure DNS dot and DOE performance by issuing measurements to recursive resolvers that take the place of the test servers in this picture. So we agreed with the FCC to anonymize three popular recursive resolvers that we perform measurements with, which we refer to as X, Y, and Z in the remainder of the talk. We also measured the local resolvers that are provided by the home network. So this gives us a sense of what DNS performance is like for the resolvers that users have configured compared to some popular resolvers that support DNS dot and DOE. So with the open resolvers, we measure DNS dot and DOE, and with the local resolver, we just measure DNS. So I'm now going to get into the results of our measurements, and we explain the measurement protocol in much more detail in our full paper. I want to quickly note that for dot and DOE, we are only considering response times after connection establishment. And thus, we do so because for each combination resolver in a protocol, Sam Knows will open a dot or DOE connection, perform measurements for 10 domain names, and then close the connection. So we believe that if we include these connection establishment times within each measurement, we may negatively skew the performance of dot and DOE. But we will study connection establishment times separately in a later slide. So this figure shows a box plot of query response times across all protocols and resolvers, and the horizontal line in each box shows the median query response time. Our first finding is that surprisingly, DOT can outperform DNS for resolvers X and Y after connection establishment. And when DOT doesn't outperform DNS, in the case of resolver Z, it performs relatively close. We also find that DOE performs significantly worse than DOT and DNS, with significant variation across resolvers. So we next turn to study the effect of network performance on query response times for DNS dot and DOE. To do so, we first investigate the effect of latency to resolvers on query response times. To measure latency, at the top of each hour, each white box submitted 5 ICMP pings to each recursive resolver and then took the average. Each box plot thus shows query response times binned by the white box's median latency to a recursive resolver. We find that as latency increased, .NET continues to match DNS in median query response times. And we also see that DOE continues to perform significantly worse than DNS and DOT as latency increases. We also investigate how a user's subscribed downstream throughput to their ISP affects query response times. And similarly, we are binning the query response times by the subscription downstream throughput for each white box. So we also find that downstream throughput affects query response times, but to a lesser extent than latency. For DOE, we do see a significant improvement in query response times as downstream throughput increases, though. So I also want to note that many users in the lower throughput tiers were also using DSL, which may at least in part account for high DNS response times. We also find that DOT and DOE performance varies significantly across ISPs. So in this case, for each ISP and resolver, we subtract the median DNS response time for that resolver across the 5 ISPs for each DOT and DOE measurement. Thus, if a median query response time was below 0, then the respective encrypted DNS protocol performed better than DNS for that. So in short, no single resolver performed the best across all ISPs, and resolver performance can differ across ISPs. Lastly, we study connection establishment times for DOT and DOE. Before any queries can be sent with DOT and DOE, the white boxes must first establish a TCP and TLS session with their recursive resolver. We find little variation in connection setup times across the resolvers, and most of the overhead comes from establishing a TLS session. Thus, we argue that with connection reuse and well-chosen timeouts, the cost of setting up DOT and DOE can be amortized. So in summary, we find that after connection establishment, DOT performance is so close to DNS performance that users can get privacy virtually for free. And in some cases, DOT was able to perform even better than DNS. We also find that DOE performs significantly worse than DNS and DOT in general. We hope that our work provides valuable data for browser vendors, operating system developers, and resolver maintainers to support the encryption of DNS traffic. I thank you all for listening to our talk, and I have many people to thank in conducting this work, ranging from the FCC to Sam Knows, to Jason Livingood and Al Morton for helping with the study design. And I'm happy to take any questions. So thank you very much, and yeah.